Okay, morning everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to this Decarbonising the Northwest event with Place Northwest. I'm Paul Unger, publisher of Place Northwest. We've got an action-packed couple of hours with a really great lineup. I'm very excited to bring you. Welcome to Remo, our dedicated events platform for those that have not been to one of our virtual events before. Please do fill in your profile and do switch your camera on in the networking sessions. It's good fun and much better experience for everyone to get the most out of the morning. Decarbonising property, obviously a very crucial subject and a fascinating one, but not an area of the industry that seems to get much easier to solve, no matter how much buy-in there is these days. The urgency is there. But is the money, are the skills and the technology there to bring us any closer to net zero carbon in real estate? Hopefully we'll find out and get a bit closer to the answer this morning. There are a lot of you watching who know an awful lot more about this and how it affects your businesses and project work on a daily basis than I ever will. So don't leave it to me to grill the panelists. Please do get involved. And if I put it this way, we've got some very clever people here for you this morning, and this is your chance for some free advice. I'd like to thank our wonderful sponsors, Morgan Sindall Construction, Devonshire's and Hydrock for arranging today's event with Place Northwest. There'll be two panels. In the first half, we will look at new build, and in the second, we will examine retrofit of existing buildings. To give us an overview of the strategy needed in property to tackle both of these types of project, we're very lucky to have someone that's doing this on the ground, Josh Bullard of Hydrock, to give us a quick presentation to get us underway. Welcome, Josh. If you turn your camera on.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Morning. I'll step out shortly, other than to say you can enlarge the slides to read those a bit easier if you click on the square of arrows to go full screen in the corner of the slides. I'll see you afterwards. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Paul. So just to introduce myself very quickly, I'm the Divisional Director for the Smart Energy and Sustainability team at Hydrock. So my background, quite mixed, but really it's around energy master planning and sustainability strategies, right from building level up to large new settlements, district heating, various other projects over the years in terms of really helping to decarbonise assets. So I also sit on the Bristol Committee for Climate Change and have a number of interests around sort of policy position movements in relation to energy and buildings. So just a very quick overview of Hydrock, for I'm sure a number of you will be aware of us already. We are a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy UK-wide with a local presence in Manchester. So my team is about 30 strong and a real mixture of consultants, engineers, energy specialists and climate scientists. So we cover quite a broad range of areas really across estate management in terms of decarbonisation, both for corporate and individual estates. In terms of the Northwest, we're working with several large universities in particular, working with local developers really to help unlock and understand what does the future of development look like in terms of net zero. The other aspect that we're also covering is in relation to energy assets. So we have a delivery arm that looks at large-scale energy projects. So we've got a pipeline of about 200 megawatts at the moment, and primarily around battery storage. And we've got in the locality a 50 megawatt system that we're looking at near Crewe. So that's going to be built out over the next couple of years. So quite a number of projects where we're really looking to help in terms of the grid piece of the macro, in terms of how can we deliver energy. Just a final bit, we recently joined the Advancing Net Zero programme with the UK Green Building Council, and in terms of our own emissions, we're committed to net zero by 2030. So that's scope 1 and 2 by 2025, and where possible then our scope 3 emissions by 2030. So that's all being independently verified through the Science Based Targets Initiative. So Just a quick summary. We've got about 15 minutes today just to sort of rattle through this. So it's going to be fairly high level because there's obviously a lot of content to get through here and help to convey. But just very briefly, I want to start with the sort of key assumptions. How do we get to net zero and what are the prerequisites in order to do that? What's the timeline then and the funding streams that are available, and a couple of notes on the budget announcements yesterday. Then we'll look a bit at the Northwest region in particular and some of the sort of nuances around the opportunities. And then a bit of a focus on new development with a case study, and then we'll wrap things up with a sort of summary on those opportunities again. So going right to the macro in terms of the UK as a whole, we know we're signed up to UK net zero by 2050. So this is going to require institutional and transformational change, as we know, and some significant steps in terms of challenges around behaviour. Most of the sort of low-hanging fruit and what we would refer to as the easy wins at this point have already been taken. And when we look at all the work to date in terms of decarbonisation and the various carbon budgets, and we're just going into the 6th, around 75% of that in terms of the work to date has actually all been through the grid. So a big win there and a real success story in terms of the national grid. But now we need to really start to tackle all of the other sectors, transport, heat, buildings in particular, which we're focused on today, and then the harder to tackle elements around carbon capture and storage for agriculture and some of our chemical industries. So a lot of work there that's going to be required. Just in terms of that scale of the challenge again, Climate Change Committee estimates around 16 billion a year enabled for us to do that. So that's about 1% of our GDP. Now, interestingly, that has come down. The previous estimates were around 50 billion. So what we're starting to see is the assumptions around behaviour, falls in technology costs, efficiency gains. While these were uncertain, we're starting to see some certainty now as we move things forward. And everything that's happening around the energy white paper and announcements in terms of trajectory towards that grid emissions reduction and other projects is really helping to put together a roadmap of how we can get there. So let's sort of jump into those key assumptions. So we've looked at the UK as a whole. We're now coming down to what we call the sort of regional level or local authority level. So just to start with, I focused here on 2030 because that's the most ambitious, and certainly if we talk about Liverpool or some of the other local authorities, that is the objective. However, that can change depending on what date we're looking at. So I just want to sort of run through these quickly, and then we'll focus on a couple of those in particular around the regulatory position and funding. So at the moment, we do have this disjoint between the commitments we've made in terms of net zero commitments and climate emergency versus what the regulatory system and planning system can actually achieve. So there is this disjoint around timings and the urgency point. So we need that to get up to speed. Funding, of course, needs to be secured, and we'll touch on this in terms of the budget positions on a couple of slides' time. But we also need a supply chain that is adequate and an educational programme. Just taking a couple of points, heat pumps, for example, we need to upscale that by about 30 times in the next 10 years to actually get anywhere close to what we need. So if we look at the Green Homes Grant as a sort of example of where there's been a policy failure, the primary reason for that is around the supply chain and the lack of ability to be deploying these at scale quickly enough. So we really need to get this in place to help move things forward. So other key points around ensuring that we as a region can hit this net zero target, and what do we need outside of our influence perhaps? We need the grid to be fully decarbonised. So the National Grid ESO has committed that by 2025 it's going to be able to operate for 100% renewables. That's not that it will be 100% carbon reduction year round, but at any one time it will be able to operate from those renewables. Then as we move towards 2030, the likelihood is we'll be at around 90% reduction, and then moving into 2030s and beyond, then a net uplift and surplus energy, which is of course going to be going into our various hydrogen projects. So this leads us on to divestment from gas, of course, and fossil fuels. This is a key prerequisite to enable this to happen. Likewise, in terms of transport, we need to divest from fossil fuels and move towards electric or ultra-low energy vehicles. And not just a shift in terms of modal, but we need behavioural shifts as well. I mean, the best case scenario in terms of taking on board all of the change for electrification of heat and electrification of transport is going to be between a third and a doubling of power. So quite significant as we move towards 2030. So what else? We need emissions from our waste streams to be near to zero, of course. And importantly for our development projects, the assumption is that there'll be no new net emissions as we hit 2030. So that is absolutely crucial. So the worst case, 2030, we need to be at net zero. And on the retrofit side, well, all these buildings need to be tackled before 2050, or indeed by these more accelerated emissions dates of 2030 or 2040 in the case of the wider Northwest. So how are we going to do that? Well, practically, we have either one or two opportunities to get it right when we talk about retrofit programs. So a big challenge there in how we move that forward. And then finally, the CCS, carbon capture and storage, and offsetting. Only once we've done all these other aspects can we then start to look at that in terms of the harder to treat areas. So that's some prerequisites that we believe are necessary to enable us to then deliver on these commitments. So on the regulatory timeline and funding, just jumping here across to the built environment, in particular, a focus on buildings. So we had the energy white paper back in October. And off the back of that, the heat and building strategy, which will be coming out in the spring, and the non-domestic consultation. So this year, I believe, is the most ever consultations in relation to energy and sustainability. So a huge amount of work is going to this at the moment, and we're going to see an acceleration in terms of regulatory changes, looking in particular into probably spring 2022 to get the interim measures in terms of future home standard. So that's the update in terms of conservation of fuel and power for buildings and the primary metric of how we determine carbon reduction. So you can see there roughly a 30% reduction against what we're currently working to, which is 2013, very antiquated in terms of its regulations and where it sits in terms of actual carbon factor. So a complete departure there, and then full adoption by 2025. So really starting to push us towards that net zero obligation. So around 3/4 in terms of the carbon reduction. Alongside that, we then have the gas ban and full EV rollout. So the requirement likely to be, once we get the consultation response this year, that it will require in every unit. And just on this committed funding, we can see a significant amount of work that's going in there in terms of committed funds, and a number of these, of course, are going to be in the Northwest, and we'll touch on this on the next slide. So just from the budget announcements yesterday, I think one key point is around the emergence of the new infrastructure bank. So this has been set up in particular to deliver on net zero. So our understanding is that that'll be around 12 billion of funding, and we'll see how that's going to be distributed over the next year or so. So again, just on I will pick out the Green Homes Grant because that was conspicuous in its absence, and so about 1.5 billion of that we were expecting to be rolled over, but that will probably come back in some other form once we've got around that supply chain issue. So that was a bit of an overview. And now jumping into the region in particular and the focus on the Northwest. So the graphic on the right, what we've tried to do here is basically look at all of the climate emergency declarations that the region has undertaken and map that in terms of a picture of where we are. So grey being effectively aligned with UK government and the wider UK position, 2050. But actually, as we know, in the recent weeks, in fact, we now have the first coherent blueprint across the UK in terms of a regional focus on net zero carbon. So there is alignment across the whole of the Northwest now towards this 2040 objective. Now, of course, there are certain areas, I mean, Cheshire East and Oldham in particular have committed to 2025, certainly for their own operational estate. And actually, if we take Liverpool, is working towards the city itself for 2030. So there are still some discrepancies there, and of course some differences in the ambitions of how quickly we can accelerate. And there's regional nuances, of course, in terms of the ability and the opportunities in relation to the locality, but really encouraging that we have this blueprint now across the whole region to drive that. And that is the first in the UK, so a really good step. Just picking on a couple of other points here, and again, just before I move on, the reason for that, and I thought was a really interesting quote from Andy Burnham. So combination of natural assets, those two key cities, political will and strong alignment, so really helping to push point that at home around the urgency point. So where are we in terms of industry? Well, if we talk about HyNet, an interesting point here, around 80% of all of the hydrogen production target for the UK as a whole will be delivered through that one project towards 2030. So huge opportunity there. And indeed, aligned to that as well, 100% of all the CCS as well to 2030. And then linked, we have the further net zero carbon industrial cluster, so about 4 billion of funding going into that as we move towards 2040. Further, I mean, we could talk about this and the opportunities, but 30,000 jobs will be created through there. And I think Greater Manchester alone, we're looking at around 55,000 jobs. So that is significant. Just final points on the budget announcements as well. Liverpool has just got the Freeport announcement and the renewed emphasis there again around industry and the green economy. So I suppose my only minor point here is around the coal mine in Cumbria. So interesting to see how that progresses and whether it goes ahead. But yeah, one for discussion separately, I suspect. So that's the region, and again, we've not got time to sort of delve into every locality in particular, but just picking the two sort of major cities, Liverpool and Manchester, I thought it'd be worth just bringing up a couple of points here around the work to date and those commitments. So Cadent, along with Electricity North West and Navigator, put together decarbonisation pathways for a number of scenarios for Greater Manchester, for Cumbria and for Lancashire. So what they're looking at here is really starting to understand and map out heat, power and transport vectors. So what do we need to do? What do those scenarios look like? Is it a balanced scenario? Are we looking at the modal behavioural shifts, demand side shifts, or is it entirely technologically driven? So looking then at the two cities that are put up there, I thought interesting. So Liverpool, around 42% reduction in the last 15 years, I should say, apologies. So that's encouraging, and progress to date there, similar to Manchester, is around electricity green PPAs, so in terms of signing up and obligating to use renewables, of course, EV conversion, ramping up of the energy efficiency schemes and retrofit programs, and large-scale renewables, whether that's solar, hydrogen projects, and others. I just want to pick one point on Manchester as well, and we can see the slight variances in terms of the commitment dates. But 2028 target, which we're expecting to come in relatively soon in terms of net zero, so building on what's happening with the Future Home Standard and Future Building Standard. But that final point, I think, is really key, and where we can maximise the opportunities that we have in the region. So restoration of peatlands is a significant opportunity for Manchester of actually putting in a natural sequestration device. So we've got artificial sinks and we've got natural sinks. And actually, peatlands is a real opportunity to lock in the carbon in the soils through decomposition. Further to that, of course, we can also alleviate and provide flood protection and ecosystem replenishing. So this is where we can start to see the combining of opportunities, co-locate different activities to really benefit across the board. We're talking about climate emergency, but actually there is an ecological emergency linked to that. So really important that we're tackling all of these various aspects as we move towards net zero. So that gives us a bit of an overview of the region, and again, somewhat limited by time, so we could touch on that and the sort of details there. But wanted to just give a little bit of focus, and we're sort of delving down and getting into the granular now a little bit around new development in particular and what needs to happen in terms of the approach. And the aspect here is around where we are at the moment in terms of good practice and good design, and what do we need to do to transition to that requirement for net zero by 2030. So we've got colleagues here from UK Green Building Council, and this is very much the approach that we would take, is around this hierarchical approach to carbon reduction. So the graphic on the screen, what this is conveying is effectively all of the components for a building in terms of, if you think about the red line of the building itself, the envelope, and we'll touch on the kind of external elements as well in terms of what's in scope and out of scope. But specifically for the building envelope itself, really we have two key aspects. On the left-hand side, what you can see there is the operational energy. So all of the energy that goes into the building, whether it's the regulated loads from our heating, our domestic hot water, and all of the plant systems, or the what we call the unregulated loads, which are related to our plugins and various systems that we'll be using as a tenant, as an occupier, as a building owner. So those that aren't necessarily regulated under building regulations. On the right-hand side, then, we have the embodied carbon elements, so everything that's going into the whole life cycle of the building through the operational and indeed the construction activities, end of use, the circular economy of how we develop and provide a building. So just touching on these, and what this is really trying to show here is the approach that we would take to get to a net zero building. So I want to pick up on the five graphics, the operational energy, future of heat. So these come from the London Energy Transformation Initiative. So I suppose there's three core standards that we would always advocate in terms of an approach to net zero. The first is the UK Green Building Council framework, which provides the overarching methodology in terms of operational emissions, embodied carbon, and indeed whole life carbon. The London Energy Transformation Initiative then is looking at effectively archetypes, so different building types, what is the right approach as a bit of a starting point. It's not a one solution fits all, but really starting to look at the empirical evidence of what has worked in practice. How do we tackle this performance gap issue, and what's the appropriate use of different measures to get us towards that net zero transition? So I'll just touch on a couple of those. So the operational energy, well, really, this is around the energy use intensity. So how far can we push the envelope, whether it's from the fabric or the services and efficiency and behavioural habits, to get us down to a position where we're not impacting on that grid capacity. So I suppose the 2 points there's firstly, get off gas, move towards an electric product, which gives us then the ability to transition alongside the grid. And then it's how do we utilise that energy without causing undue capacity constraints? We need to ensure that we're doing everything we can to limit the impact through demand reduction. Demand side response then, the third aspect there, I just want to pick up on. So really what this is looking at is helping to understand how can we load shift in our building? When are we actually using energy, and what does that mean in terms of the grid? So the grid itself, if we talk about capacity, it all comes down to diversity of portfolio. Not everyone's going to be using electricity at the same time. So how can we maximize those opportunities through energy storage systems, principally batteries in the building, through being smart in terms of when we're using appliances, and how can we benefit in terms of the changes that are happening on the grid in terms of both dynamic carbon, so the carbon is not consistent depending on what energy is being used to facilitate that electrical production, and also dynamic pricing as well. So we already have dynamic pricing on the non-domestic market, and agile tariffs are already coming in terms of the domestic market. We're going to see an acceleration of that over the next few years. So we're focused on carbon here, but significant opportunities beyond the pure carbon. We can look at revenue opportunities in terms of accessing energy markets. We can look at cost savings in terms of that utility stacking, avoidance of red band periods, and really shifting our demand periods. And then finally, helping to unlock capacity and, of course, providing resilience as we move forward, so future-proofing that asset. So the final 2 points there, data disclosure and renewables, absolutely crucial. Digitization, digital twinning, this is all going to help us in terms of alleviating that performance gap. So that's a kind of very high-level overview, and I wanted to jump into now a key example. So we've got colleagues, Stuart from Glenbrook and Alison as well from Shepherd Robson here today, and we wanted to touch on Vox, so Cornbrook in Manchester, as a case study. So this is a build-to-rent development I'm sure many of you be aware of, practical completion as of January, and really a significant emphasis here around health and well-being. So we were appointed to undertake a carbon benchmarking exercise, so help to understand what's the baseline that we're working to at the moment. We're taking a good practice development and helping to understand now, how do we transition now towards 2030? What do we need to do to help understand all of those various aspects we've just talked about? So review and develop an approach in terms of that benchmarking. So I'll just take through some of the sort of key observations really that we had, and the approach that we took in terms of helping to understand. So a couple of graphics here. On the left-hand side, what we're looking at there is the whole life carbon, somewhat simplified in terms of the assessment that was made, but just to help understand some of the key aspects as we move through the development. So the purple is the embodied carbon, and then we can see the operational emissions moving forward from 2020 and as the grid is decarbonised. So we took quite a cautious approach with this. What we know, based on what I was saying earlier, that actually the likelihood is we're probably going to be mitigating that much earlier towards 2030. So that will come down. But we can see as we move through the product life cycle, in each of the key stages, we're looking at key replacement dates, how are we going to recycle and mitigate the impacts upon the disposal, moving all the way through the whole building life cycle. So by way of comparison, we can see current building regulations, where the development sits, which is already good practice, significant improvement over the baseline emissions, in particular around the operational carbon through the measures that were taken. So how was that achieved? Well, quite a few areas really, but just to pick out some of them, a very efficient form factor and fabric. So when we think about the external envelope and the surface area in relation to the volume, actually it's a very efficient envelope in terms of what was produced because of the story heights and the density of the scheme. So that enables us really to reduce the space fabric requirements and indeed the internal gains. So efficient form of fabric was the first one. We then had an efficient services strategy, an all-electric approach, so moving away from gas in particular, and mechanical ventilation and heat recovery to help reduce the ventilation heat losses. So it's worth saying here, New development, and in particular, one of the aspects we're looking at is decoupling where necessary the heat and domestic water requirements. And particularly for flatter development, the critical concern is often overheating as opposed to space heating. So really, it's how do you tackle and provide efficient domestic hot water provisions for the development, and how can we tackle and alleviate that overheating point as well. Just on the embodied carbon then, again, a success story here in terms of some of the measures that were taken. So efficiency through density, again, in particular around the foundations and the amount of concrete that was used. And the design team, if we look at the phasing, really this was a critical area that helped in terms of alleviating relative to other comparable developments. So what they were able to do was effectively reduce the quantum of aggregates. So to give one example, the slabs were laid earlier in relation to then the external cladding, which meant that the slabs could cure over a longer period, which meant the depths could be reduced. So that alone, I believe, saved around 300 meters cubed of concrete, so about 5-6% of the overall emissions there, just from that one measure. So that, coupled with numerous other measures, was actually quite critical to providing that reduction. And we can see there starting to get closer to the LETI position in terms of that energy use intensity and carbon. So phasing absolutely critical there. So in terms of those scenarios then, we then looked at a number of variables and sensitivity in terms of what do we need to do to align as we move forward to that 2030 objective, whether it's the UK Green Building Council, the LETI guidelines, or indeed the REBA 2030 challenge. And importantly, they are all aligned in terms of the objectives and what's required. So just picking out a few of the sort of key sensitivity variables, I'll pick up the occupancy behaviour one, because you can see on the right-hand side there, this was a real critical factor. And if we talk about what building regulations tells us in terms of sort of typical profiles versus what is actually happening in practice, well, you can see from the graphic in terms of those three sort of orange gold bars, this is effectively looking at set point control and occupancy behaviour around time of use, how are people behaving in the building, and the impact it has on energy use intensity. So you can see there a doubling potentially in terms of the offset requirements when we look at the ultimate carbon reduction, depending on how people are using the building. So yes, we need to do everything we can in terms of demand reduction on our estates, on our buildings, in terms of design. We then need to be really thinking about what is the operational strategy of the building, how is it maintained and operated, do the residents understand and have the ability to control over this? So how are they using the smart appliances, and what measures are in place on that demand side response point that I mentioned? So quite a critical aspect. So offset, of course, density provides a benefit for us in terms of that form factor and some of the embodied carbon bits, but it does provide a challenge in terms of on-site reduction. So we had the ability to fit quite a significant PV array, but it would probably get about 20% reduction. So we then had to look at, well, what are the other offsetting measures in terms of taking that forward if we were to try and do a day one reduction and not rely on that grid decarbonisation point. So remembering it's an all-electric solution, so we do have that opportunity if we can align to those objectives. So we did look at some other factors around how do we offset and what programs could we put in place. So accredited offsite measures and exploration of potentially aggregating those across an estate. So not got time today to go through that in detail, but could that be energy projects? Could we then get access to the energy markets under PPA, private wire or otherwise? So potential revenue streams coupled with this point around resilience. So I wanted just to pick up, I suppose, a final point here on the kind of cost point. So ultimately, we're trying to align any cost uplift in terms of future asset value uplift on the ESG criteria. So how can we ensure that the future proofing of the development and any cost uplift is aligned to that, so that we're maximising benefit in terms of future yields and ensuring that the product is fit for purpose going forward? So all of the institutional funds and indeed the investors on the project, this is the direction of travel and is a requirement in terms of where we're moving. So we need to ensure these benchmarks, not just from energy, but across the social and governance aspects, are picked up as part of this. So just a final note here before jumping slide, we can see there some of the reduction measures that were investigated. So principally, it was moving to a heat pump-led solution, some improvements around the fabric, although we'd already taken some pretty significant steps there. And then principally around those behavioural aspects and the sort of demand side measures and smart appliances as we move towards 2030. So key outcomes, and just to summarize again really here, a significant improvement was made already on the development. So it was really understanding how do we go from this low carbon position to that full net zero outcome towards 2030. So early buy-in and agree objectives, absolutely critical. Is everyone on the same page in terms of what we're designing and what we're committing to on those various design guides? We also need to ensure that we're aligning that in terms of any of the BIM criteria and the Revit modeling. So are we ensuring that the material aspects, the carbon inventory is picked up right from the inception, and we're not having to backtrack and do this as we move through this sort of detailed design period? So taking every measure that we can as early as possible. So alignment with those standards. Phasing, absolutely critical, and decisions that are made there can have a significant impact on the ultimate embodied carbon criteria. So one that needs consideration as we look at programming. On-site generation then, of course, and smart technology, as I've talked about. Performance gap elimination, another critical aspect here. So how can we ensure we're setting realistic goals, monitoring the ongoing performance, and identifying strategies, whether it's through post-occupancy evaluation, monitoring through the sub-metering strategy, ensuring that's then built into the next site. So absolutely critical. And that final bit there, again, this sort of decoupling of the cost and value aspects and bringing those together. So cost and value uplift, so align to ESG principles in particular and future asset value. We need to ensure critically that we're not providing products that aren't going to be investable in future. So don't get left behind, stay ahead of the curve and preempt those regulatory changes as they come. So that's it. I think I've probably gone over time already, so I'll just very quickly summarize again. Huge opportunities for us and the region. Just on some of the sort of job side, 55,000 job creation in Manchester alone, 40,000 for the world first net zero carbon industrial cluster. So a significant amount of emphasis and that funding is going to be going to the northwest around that industrial cluster. We've got the urgency through political will, and we do have that collective view in terms of a coherent strategy for net zero by 2040. Some challenges, of course, around that heat and power infrastructure, but if we can get the infrastructure in place and those pathways mapped, we're on track in terms of delivering that strategy. I think that's it. So just a final point, if anyone wants to have a look at some of our other webinars that goes into some more detail, there's a sort of half-hour session on each of those. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh. There we go. If I could ask our other panelists to activate their cameras and mics, we'll get the panel discussion underway. Thank you. That's great. We'll do a quick round of introductions. When I come to you, if you just say who you are, where you're from, what you do, starting with Alison.
Great. Hi. So my name's Alison O'Reilly. I'm head of sustainability at Shepherd Robson. For anyone that's not familiar with us, we're a long-established architecture and interior design practice, and we have offices in London, Manchester, and Glasgow. I work alongside our sustainability group and across the practice, and my role is to champion all aspects of sustainability, so from our approach to sustainable practice, but also our operational side and our environmental management system.
Thank you. And John?
Hi everyone, John Alker, Director of Policy and Places at the UK Green Building Council. I've got a national role, but based in the Northwest. And Josh has already done a brilliant job of promoting UKGBC quite enough this morning, so I don't think I need to say much more.
Well, please do stay around. And Stuart?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Stuart McCrone. I'm Projects Director at Glenbrook. I'm responsible for project delivery throughout the Glenbrook business. And thanks to Josh and the presentation there on Vox. I'm not sure I've got a much amount to add to that. So thanks, Josh.
Yeah, and Stuart, just if I could start with you. I mean, as you say, Josh has already sort of touched on in quite some detail on Vox. This is obviously something you're actively looking at. How have you approached the whole sort of net zero challenge as a business at Glenbrook?
Yeah, we found that net zero, or certainly low carbon and working towards net zero, came into sharp focus the early part of last year. I think alongside many in the industry, to be honest. I think lockdown certainly has a part to play in that. It in our mindset for some time, but not really understanding how to approach this, who to work with. It's clearly a very complex situation. And I picked up on a number of the webinars that Josh mentioned at the end of his presentation there. And I picked up the phone to Josh last summer, and we had a good conversation. And we found that we needed to benchmark one of our latest schemes just to understand what's our starting point, what is our existing carbon footprint on one of our developments. Because it's only once we know and understand that we can start to plan out a roadmap to how we get to net zero. And as Josh has already alluded to, I think the results surprised us, in all honesty. I don't think we'd appreciated some of the approaches and the measures that we were already applying to our developments were having such a positive impact on reducing our carbon emissions. But it's only the beginning of a journey to get to net zero ultimately.
Yeah, and Alison, a lot of people will be looking for the consultants at the early stage, the architects, the M&E advisors to be setting the sort of the right path, the standards for this. Tell us what your approach has been to adapting at Shepherd Robson.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And I think key to that is sort of establishing the team and the right team. And I think one thing I'd like to say too is knowing that it's still in discussion. So we haven't sort of landed on the exact pathway. And it's not a matter of sort of taking building off shelf A opposed to shelf B. You need the team and you need the right engagement process and make sure that everyone's sort of on board and able to have those discussions and learn from each other and pull in those lessons learned. And upskilling, I think, is a big one that the industry is facing now. So I know when we spoke previously, we talked about actually we don't need to push the why, and even the what seems to be coming into focus, but it's the how. And I think having an openness to testing and establishing that pathway is key. Yeah.
Okay, and John, yeah, we've seen developers really getting on board with this. There's a lot of pledges being made, and we receive press releases of X, Y, and Z company that have set their date and what they're going to do. Are we really seeing the action behind the words as well?
I think we are. Yeah, it's been amazing. I think, it's been a weird year, right? But I think we had a session of BDP, Paul, that you chaired for Place Northwest about a year ago, almost exactly.
Yeah.
And well, A, who could have predicted, etc. But B, actually the appetite in amongst businesses in this sector has just kind of grown exponentially over a period of time when we might have expected a much more kind of inward, kind of insular, kind of focus, and obviously colleagues on the panel are demonstrating some of that. But no, I mean, I think that no doubt there's a greater appetite and demonstration of acting on that ambition than we have seen ever before. And I think despite all of that, the industry as a whole, is a very broad and very diverse one, and that the leadership that we're seeing in many places is great, but we do need to see a level playing field, and we do need to see a raising of the bar. And that helps to address the costs issue as well, because if it's the same for everybody, then we can get a handle on that, and it can impact, land valuation and so on. So I think it's critical that that national policy trajectory is there. I think it's also really important that these local targets that Josh touched on in terms of climate emergency and so on translate into the planning and regulation. And what we are now starting to see is I think a real recognition from local authorities that it's all really difficult, but the easiest bit is the new build bit. And really, there's kind of no time to lose, because the whole planning system has it takes ages, and local authorities need to be taking those opportunities in the kind of the next update to their local plans to integrate much more ambitious planning policy, as places like Manchester are doing, even now likely to go ahead of the GM 2028 target.
Yeah, it still feels like on that standardization point that you mentioned there, you've got REBA, some people aiming towards, there's UN goals, there's LETI in London, there's yourselves and your frameworks at UK GBC, there's BREEAM, LEED, WELL, there's all these different things. It still feels like developers that might be starting out saying, show me what good looks like and which one to follow. It still seems quite a confusing landscape.
I think I appreciate that, and I'm not underplaying that. I think when you get into it, and when you're guided by the likes of Josh and others, I think those kind of component parts do make sense. And I think what we are seeing now is a convergence of principles, a convergence around key metrics, overall kind of strategies and approaches. And I think where you sort of see slight differences emerging, there's always going to be different tools in the market to help you do what you want to do. That's natural. I think there is still divergence in terms of some of the policy approaches, and we and others are trying to do our best around that. And there's certain divergence around kind of level of ambition, and that's always natural. So you have organizations like LETI that are doing really good work, super ambitious, kind of setting out, this is what kind of bleeding edge, kind of practice looks like. And organizations like ours that are taking that on board and trying to translate that for any policymaker to implement anywhere in the country. So I think that's why there are slight differences of approaches, but I think we're all also ultimately moving in the same direction.
Yeah, and Alison, when it comes to the sort of briefs that you're getting from developers, tell me how that looks now compared to 12 months ago when it comes to wanting more sustainable buildings. Do they all get it?
Yeah, really good question, and I'll echo, I think John mentioned it, that we have seen a real increase in interest in the zero carbon agenda, but that has come with a range of intelligence behind it. So it's fascinating, because we are seeing people coming forward and asking for zero carbon, BREEAM outstanding, WELL gold, but maybe the project's in stage 2 already, and there's not much time or money for it. We're also seeing the really clued up developers obviously coming forward, and that's where a lot of those really outstanding projects are coming from, that the whole industry is benefiting from. But what's so fascinating is, yes, we are even getting asked for this to be on the agenda before knowing really what it means. So I suppose you could see that as a really good thing, actually. But like I said before, it's not taking a building off shelf A instead of shelf B. There's a lot behind that. So we're finding ourselves in a place where we need to kind of have that discussion to educate actually what are the implications of these targets in terms of program and costs and things like that. But while we and the industry are learning it. So it's a really exciting time, but it obviously has its challenges there.
Yeah, learning as you go. And Stuart, John mentioned there about the costs, and Josh has mentioned on costs. Talk to us a little bit about going through this process of trying to reduce carbon and the whole sort of cost premium question. Does it, what impact does it have on modelling?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex situation around cost. What we managed to achieve on Vox was probably, roughly speaking, cost neutral. Some of the lean design principles that were applied, Josh touched on the volume of concrete that was used in the substructure and the frame. The application of lean design principles there is actually about trying to reduce the volume of materials that you're needing to put into the building. And that in itself should generate some degree of cost saving. It's not as straightforward as that is the reality. You can't just take lumps of concrete out of the building and expect it to still stand up. So applying some of those principles didn't come at a cost premium. The enhanced thermal envelope that we provided in terms of insulation performance and air tightness performance does come at a cost, albeit it was fairly negligible. So we were comfortable with the cost implications we were facing. I think the cost issues are yet to hit us in reality. I think the pending update to Part L, whenever that finally lands with the industry, I think is going to introduce a step change. And some of the issues that we're going to have to start to pick up in response to that, or indeed in response to local planning policy, is the introduction of air source or heat pump technologies more generally. And that is going to come at a significant cost. And then we start to get into scheme viability and the cost versus value point with our funding partners. And our funds are very much aligned with this, although I think it's very early stages in that process. I don't think many in the industry are fully have a full enough grasp of what's involved in all of this to really appreciate what the positive impact on value might be as a function of a net zero building.
Yeah, I was going to come on to value, because it's almost every day there's another large investor or institution comes out with a statement around sustainability, and Aviva have made some very bold noises, and as a shareholder, not just in real assets, but they're going to withdraw from companies that can't do what they say they're going to do around fossil fuels. If you get to a stage where buildings that aren't net zero won't be sold, then that really puts pressure on developers. Do you see that sort of turning of the screw coming from the funds, because you've forward funded some of your developments? So
yeah, we've forward funded all of our developments to date with a number of different funds. It's very much in their focus at the moment. I think those funds are getting pressure from their own investors to improve their performance around sustainability and what are they doing to move towards net zero. They're all beginning to adopt their own policies and impose is the wrong word, but to apply those to the schemes that they are forward funding. And we're in those sorts of discussions with all of our funding partners at the moment. But it's then getting the understanding of, well, we can get to net zero carbon, or we can get to BREEAM excellent or BREEAM outstanding, but it's being able to explain to them in detail what the cost implications are of doing that, because that will impact scheme viability, and viability is already tight enough as it is, to be honest. But it's making sure that the value side of it is properly recognised, to ensure that we're not trying to achieve something that is just going to squeeze viability too far, and then schemes simply don't get delivered.
Yeah, and Josh, just to add on that cost and the viability, you've been doing this benchmarking process with quite a few developers. What have been some of the you can share when it comes down to the practical sort of development models?
Yeah, in terms of cost uplift, I mean, we've undertaken similar exercises across quite a few sites. And I think if you look at the sort of value uplift or cost uplift on certainly the build to rent, we've seen anything from sort of 5 to sort of 10% on as a kind of uplift on capex to hit that net zero target as a sort of representative number, which I think is broadly aligned to where the UK Green Building Council document that John shared. So yes, there is that cost uplift. But then if you look at operational savings in particular around the rental model and where that's being aligned, some of the revenue streams that are coming from the energy assets, that can be built into the economic model, taking it forward. So I think there are opportunities there, certainly, in terms of how you demonstrate that payback and looking at it as a sort of portfolio approach as well. I think that's critical.
Yeah, you mentioned about the operation. We've had a question touching on that, because it's important to recognise what the occupiers want as well, whether it's residential or offices. What are they asking for? A question from Andrea in the audience. Could you share some of the initiatives and ways to overcome the challenge of dealing with behavioural response from occupants? When you get people in, you can't necessarily control what energy they use.
Absolutely. So I think, I suppose there's several ways you could look at that. Some of it is around incentivizing. So having platforms where we have the ability to have more control over these systems, smart appliances, and incentivizing it around perhaps the rental arrangement. If you talk about, if it's a BTR scheme, the ability to see some of those savings coming back is one option of looking at it. There's then the various sort of demand side approaches that we talked around in terms of that sort of load shifting and helping to alleviate some of the challenges through sort of storage technologies in particular. So there are certainly a couple of ways that we can look at it.
And Alison, can this be designed in? Is this something that occupiers are asking for across different uses, and can it be met with the design response?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because I've been hearing this sort of creep up in terms of conversation, is that sort of operational maintenance piece, and we can design buildings that meet these great targets in design, but actually how they're operated. And especially when it changes hands in terms of operations, we're finding that quite challenging. Designing in certainly, but I think there is still that gap that we need to kind of close the loop between the design team and the operations, I think.
Yeah.
Well, can I just comment on that? Sorry.
Yeah.
I would say that actually the property sector has been ahead of its occupiers on the net zero issue, and I think that needs to be rebalanced. Despite the kind of prominence of large corporate sustainability strategies, I think they've got a bit of a blind spot on their property. And I think you typically find, obviously, that the average business is not in the built environment sector, but they use a lot of the built environment. And I think I think we need to address that. We're talking to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority about a sort of corporate occupier focused low carbon buildings campaign to try to drive up the level of commitment from major occupiers in the region, and to then match the ability of owners, landlords to actually to meet that and try to meet in the middle somewhere.
Can I just add to that as well? Sort of linked, I think, is that point again around data disclosure and governance. I think often there is a challenge about what control we have necessarily over individual tenants or otherwise, how much energy is being utilised, and the sort of metering, the availability of that information, and being able to go back and review that can be quite challenging sometimes. So I think moves in that sort of data sphere are going to be interesting over the coming years. And probably just the final point as well around Internet of Things platforms, and we've got our smartphones. There's no reason why we can't be controlling all of these aspects as we come into a building, whether it's the carbon side, health and well-being, various aspects. This is all going to be much more linked as we move things forward, which I think will help on that behavioural piece as well.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Another question from Matt Pickering in the Q&A box on the right. For new build, what design decisions have had the biggest impact on whole life cycle carbon? So is it building form, building structural solution, building fabric, or the building services solution? I'll put that to Stuart. When you've looked at the benchmarking coming out with the outcomes, where do you think, you'll be going into the next project going, if there's one thing we do that gets the biggest result, it's this?
The next biggest result is without question around heat pump, the application of heat pump technologies. That was one of the key findings from the work that we did with Josh last year. The interventions that we've applied to date has, generally speaking, been positive across the board, whether it's down to structure, volume of materials, whether it's the thermal performance of the envelope, whether it's the water glazing ratio as one aspect. But for us to make a step change from the position that we have got on Vox, the heat pump technologies is the next single biggest step change without doubt.
Yeah, and when it comes to that upskilling piece that Alison mentioned, because obviously everyone's learning about this as we travel through project timelines, and it is a vast subject. Where do you see the onus as the sort of the top of the pyramid, the developer bringing in the money to make things happen? Do you take that on yourselves? Is that down to consultants? Is it the architects, the M&E? Where do you see that filling those knowledge gaps?
Yeah, it's a whole project team approach, and it has to be. Some of the performance that we achieved on Vox wasn't necessarily down to us as the developer. What was clear through the analysis that we did, that there are the situation is evolving through industry bodies. So the structural engineers, as one example, they were being encouraged by their own professional body to increase their approach to lean design, and that led to the decision to refine the volume of concrete that was necessary. So we had a hand in that, but it was ultimately driven by the structural engineers. Similarly, the architects have a role to play, whether it's, again, going back to the wall and glazing ratio, and picking that up, but that itself becomes complex because it becomes a planning related matter as well, and daylight and sunlight analysis becomes a factor that gets thrown into the mix as well. But generally speaking, it has to be a team approach. And one of the key takeaways for us from the report done last year was to develop our own standard Glenbrook design guide that we put out to all of our design team members. And that's across any project, whether it's residential and BTR, or whether it's the industrial sector or the office sector. We have a principal document that underlines our aspirations and sets the benchmark of what we need from all of the members of the design team, the minimum threshold that we need to achieve. And I think it's fair to say that the threshold that we achieved on Vox is an absolute minimum for us going forward, certainly on the build to rent product. So it's almost now a standing item on every project team meeting agenda that there is an emphasis on net zero carbon and design team approach and the adoption of lean design principles.
Yeah, and John, just changing tack slightly, but thoughts on the budget yesterday, and what do the government need to do, as Oliver has asked in the audience, to unlock deliverable net zero for new development?
Yeah, well, the new build, the regs piece has not been directly impacted by the budget. It's kind of on its own timeline there. We've got a bit more clarity on the residential side, be further consultation on the 2025 standard, and I think government needs to make clear, what that trajectory is beyond just regulated net zero in terms of operational and embodied, because it's nowhere on embodied. It's the local authorities that are driving the embodied piece. And as Josh referenced, we're in the middle of the consultation on the non-domestic side at the moment. I think one big thing the government could do is move to an absolute metric in terms of measuring outcomes rather than measuring kind of percentage reduction against notional buildings. I think that would be a key thing. I mean, the budget-wise, the general message from us is that it's not exactly a kind of race to zero. It's a bit more of a kind of amble to zero. It's kind of very light green tinges around the edge. You've got a session later, but the retrofit piece is still way off. Government really doesn't want to intervene in people's own decisions in their own homes, and that's where the majority of the carbon emissions are coming from.
I just wanted to add a point to what John was saying there on the regs and the sort of timeline. I mean, we did have a trajectory to get to net zero for new dwellings by 2016, so we're only 9 years late in terms of where we should have been.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alison, just touching on the upskilling you were talking about, how has Shepherd Robson gone about doing that as a practice whilst you're sort of learning live on projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's on all fronts. So I think we have integrated into existing processes. So where we share, like a big thing we do is we share projects. So we do presentations across the whole practice, and the project leads and the people involved share sort of lessons learned. And we've introduced a process to highlight the sustainability piece on it. So sharing across projects. It happens organically, of course, but this is like a bit more of a formalized process. Lots of presentations and qualification training, and then sharing those across the practice. So for example, we just had recently 3 architects qualify as passive house designers. So now we're looking at how to roll that out more widely and share their knowledge across the practice. But doing it in lots of different ways on lots of different platforms to make sure we kind of speak to people in ways that they can hear it. So it's quite a challenge to kind of to bring everybody along with that. But I think what's important is sort of like listening to what they need, because actually maybe 5 years ago we were sort of felt more like you're forcing that through. I know it's like my role being involved in sustainability before, it was a little bit more like trying to talk about these rating systems and make them more exciting, whereas now people are, I think you mentioned at the beginning, they're just so hungry for the knowledge and they want to know how. So there's a real openness and willingness and need to learn about it. So it's just about sharing all of those lessons learned from projects we find is the best way.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And Stuart, there's a question there about offsetting, which is one way that companies are reducing the sort of on paper metric of their carbon footprint. A question from Neil Allen Burt: how can industry differentiate schemes where net zero carbon is achieved through genuinely minimizing operational and embodied carbon, differentiate them from those that mainly rely on offsetting? Is this something that you're looking at in terms of the whole sort of offsetting debate?
Yeah, yes, it is. It's a good question. The harsh reality of all of this is that offsetting to some degree is inevitable. The process that we are taking is that we need to drive our low carbon strategies as far as we possibly can, but there will always come a point where it becomes, frankly, more cost effective to draw a line in the sand and then pick up whatever degree of residual carbon that you've got through some form of offset payment, in whatever shape or form that may be. I think Josh probably can explain more in terms of the specific offset options that are available. I dare say I think some people may well take an approach where they do little on the building and just think it's a case of throwing money at an offset target. It's going to cost them money one way or the other. Where the balance comes is probably the big unknown question at the moment. But we will continue to push as hard as we can to get the carbon emissions as low as we can, and then pick up any residual offset payment from there.
Yeah. And how do you guard against the tenant paying more, or the end user, whether it's a buyer or tenant, the cost being passed on to them?
I would hope that the cost isn't passed on to them. There's market forces that drive the price that people are willing to pay to occupy a build-to-rent unit. The ultimate drivers for most occupiers, and this is a generalisation, is its location and cost. Certainly at the moment, we're not seeing, and we're not necessarily directly involved in the marketing and the letting of the apartments themselves, but we're not seeing any significant questioning from occupiers about low carbon or net zero carbon performance. These new build developments are highly insulated. They have very efficient all electric heating systems in there that are Wi-Fi controlled. So actually their exposure to energy consumption is already very low from the beginning. But then we get to the point that we can't control how much energy usage that they want to consume. And we've been in apartments in the past as we go through a defects rectification process where one apartment it's almost like a sweatbox because they've got the heating on permanently throughout the summer months, whereas the person next door's got the windows wide open and it's like a freezer. So there are distinct differences in how individual tenants want to heat or cool their apartments that's simply beyond our control. All we can do is put the most energy efficient system in the apartment and make the apartment itself as energy efficient as possible from day one.
Yeah. John, would you like to see a differentiation in some endorsement or certification between those that have sort of saved the carbon on site and those that are offsetting it elsewhere, buying tree planting schemes, etc.?
Yes, in short. So we've got guidance coming out on this next week. So I think we absolutely need to be differentiating between a quality offset approach and a not quality offset approach. And there's another question actually around certification. I mean, we're not a certification body, but over the course of the next year, we're going to be working really closely with organizations that are, to ensure that there's that level of consistency across all kind of tools and approaches that aligns with the UK GBC Net Zero Carbon Framework. So yeah, very live space.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we're running out of time there. So apologies if I didn't get to your question in the audience. I'm sure Josh and others will be able to share some links and answer some of those in the chat area on some of the technical ones, such as the Crew battery storage project. Josh, there was a question about that. Thank you all very much for your input and a fantastic start to the morning's event. We'll have a short break now, 15 minutes or so, into the other room in the networking, grab a coffee and get round the tables, pop your cameras on, see who's there and have a chat, and we'll come back through at 11:25. We're now going to have a look at all things retrofit. A couple of our panelists have joined us already. If we ask the other panelists to turn on their cameras, we'll get underway. Good morning, everybody. Fresh from Sky News, we've got Wayne Bexton at Nottingham City Council. And thank you very much for joining us after your bit of broadcast this morning. And Bev Taylor from Bruntwood Works, Hannah Langford, Devonshire's, and Ryan Jude from Green Finance Initiative. Wayne, if we start with you and just talk a little bit about some of the deep sort of retrofit work that you're doing. You must be one of the only people in the country that can talk with experience about this very challenging problem. Tell us about your programme and where you're up to.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So a lot going on in Nottingham, and we've obviously made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2028, so hugely ambitious, and a massive factor of that is domestic retrofit, so a huge challenge for us across the city. We ourselves have 27,000 properties that Nottingham City Homes manage, and obviously that's been our test base, if you like, for trying to deliver retrofit pilot initiatives. As it stands, we've got a programme of around 900 properties that we're working on. A lot of analysis of our housing stock, but also the private stock across the city has been carried out. And what we've found is there's around about 10 archetypes broadly of property that we have. Obviously, those at one end of the spectrum where real deep retrofit and a large amount of intervention is required. And at the other end of the spectrum, it can be housing that's actually not in too bad a state. It might be something lighter touch to get them to our net zero principles. And so across the board, we're then managing where we target resources. Obviously, we've been rolling out the energy sprung methodology in some of our hardest to treat properties. So at that end of the spectrum I've just described, and that's a complete whole house deep retrofit method. So that's insulation, external cladding, that's interiors being changed round. So sometimes the residents are obviously taken elsewhere for a period of time or stay elsewhere for a period of time. There's smart monitoring controls in the property, solar PV, ground source heat pumps, potentially for low temperature district heating in there, and linking together through a centralised energy centre, usually a single one per 25 properties. So that's been the methodology. Hugely challenging financially, which I think I'm sure others will comment on, and that I guess is where our biggest stumbling block is. So we've had to secure grants and external money to make this viable in the short term, to try and prove a concept. And within our contracts, we've built in driving costs down. So I think what we've said to any contractors that come on board with us is we want to see costs halved pretty much over the next 18 months to make this a more sustainable long-term option. Obviously, the response we get back is volume is key, scale is key for supply chains to mature and be able to adapt to this changing market. So that's a snapshot, Paul. Happy to go into more detail.
Yeah, and when you say costs been challenging, are there any numbers that you can put on it?
Yeah, we started out, Paul, where we'd got around about every property was just under about 80k for that deep retrofit. Bearing in mind that's our hardest to treat, so it is those properties that we've got the biggest issue with. We've seen those come down now, and obviously we're advancing our thinking and our methodology for how we do retrofit. We've put a factory in place in the city that manufactures the external cladding units, and that's been a positive for local jobs and training, but also in upskilling our thinking in the organisation. We're at the moment about 65k for those that are hardest to treat. So we've seen some of those costs, as I say, be come down a little bit. I think longer term we really need to get that down, below 30k in the next couple of years to make it viable for HRA accounts nationally. And obviously we've got a lot of dialogue with housing associations, other local authorities who are watching with interest and almost looking at our grant funded programme as proving a concept and then something we can look to, or others can look to roll out at scale as well. And that's when that carrying capacity, I think, hits the right level, Paul. Because I think as soon as the market takes advantage, utilises Green Homes grants and others, we then start to see a swing in those costs, which will help everybody. Yeah, absolutely. No, fascinating work. Thank you very much. And Bev, from Bruntwood Works' point of view, how have you approached the whole challenge of low carbon and moving towards net zero?
Yeah, hi Paul. Probably for us, I think it's very similar to the points that Wayne's just made. We made a sort of a commitment that we would be net zero by 2030, in line with the UK Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero programme. And at that point, for us, it was how we then start to chart the journey from where we are to net zero. And I'm sure in this morning's session you talked a lot about the new build agenda, which I think in many ways is and this probably sounds quite trite, given what you've probably discussed this morning, but easy compared to the retrofit piece. Certainly for us, many of the same challenges that Wayne has just described. Bruntwood, our sort of business model is around taking old buildings and giving them a second life. Well, that comes with challenges, both in terms of fabric, which often isn't ideally suited to the challenges of net zero. Equally, for us as a commercial operator, we've usually got customers in our buildings, so we need to think about how we manage the retrofit program alongside them, and sometimes that means we don't often have a whole building where we can take a building and go through a design process in the same way that we would choose to. Sometimes we need to start thinking about the challenge on a piecemeal basis. What can we do on this floor that starts to move us towards our end game? So I would say particularly challenging, and in addition to those aspects, and I'm sure we'll talk about this quite a lot within within this session, cost. We can't shy away from the fact that we are a commercial entity, and there are things there, as in often there are discussions that we need to have about when is the right point in time to carry out whatever measures we deem appropriate for that net zero intervention. Is that within the normal service charge life cycle of a building? Do we know that actually we could really improve both efficiency, operational efficiency and cost for our customers by doing that earlier in a life cycle? And then we get onto the whole thing about a green lease as the answer, who benefits from whatever intervention we do, and all of the complexities that are involved in a landlord-customer relationship. So I would say certainly it's certainly not without its challenges, and I feel that probably a lot of those resonate across residential and the commercial spectrum.
Yeah, I think all sectors. And Hannah, Devonshire's work a lot with housing associations. What are they asking for when you discuss this on the agenda with them?
Thanks, Paul. Sorry, I missed the first bit. Apologies for that. My Wi-Fi is not holding up very well today. So yeah, Devonshire's acts primarily with housing associations, local authorities, the big housing associations with 100,000 plus units down to small almshouses who have got 4, 5, 8 units. But the principle is the same, really. We all know that the government have got really ambitious targets around carbon neutrality, 2015 net zero, 2030 EPC ratings of C, and equally housing associations have tenants who are in fuel poverty, who desperately need to live in warm houses. So the question that we get asked a lot is, we understand this stark law, we understand what we need to be working towards, we want to work towards it because it's the best thing for our tenants, it gets them out of fuel poverty, but where's the starting point? How do we start? And I think that, I don't think it's controversial to say that there is a little bit of a policy vacuum, and I think it's starting to be filled now. We saw last year Boris in his 10-point plan about heat pumps and hydrogen, bringing in hydrogen. We had the the budget yesterday, which talked a lot about carbon neutrality, and so it's quite a difficult question to answer, really, because whilst we know the big law and the regulatory requirements that RPs have got to comply with, what there is a little bit of lack on is policy and how to filter that through. So the way that we answer questions like that or work with clients on their carbon neutral basis is just to start at the beginning, really, which is what you guys are doing already, which is thinking about your stock, making sure you've got really good up-to-date stock surveys, knowing your tenants, knowing where they live, and then from that start to build up your plan and your business planning from that, and thinking about grants and opportunities. And then I think a really big push now will come through the the potential lending streams that are going to be available as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings us nicely on to Ryan at the Green Finance Institute. Sorry to give you a proper name. Ryan, tell us about some of the measures and products that you're bringing to market.
Yeah, cheers, Paul. So at the Institute, what we're focused on is making sure that finance isn't the blocker to retrofitting. We looked before at the fact that technologies exist and people know what needs to be done, but as Wayne touched upon, a whole home retrofit can be 80k currently. Those costs need to come down. We also see that when you do perform these retrofits, say you take out a loan, you can end up with negative returns at the minute because of the high costs of said financing. So at the Institute, what we do is we convene cross-sector experts to analyse these investment barriers, but also then develop solutions to bring to market to overcome them. So this is both from a financial product point of view, but also from an enabler point of view. So I'm happy to talk about some of the financial products later, but it's private products, so lending, be it through green home mortgages to consumers, be it through corporate loans to housing providers, and also on the public finance side. So there were some good announcements yesterday in the budget, actually specifically on green finance to do with the National Infrastructure Bank, to do with green gilts. There were, as Hannah said, some policies lacking. There was no mention of the Green Homes Grant extension, which we were listening out keenly for and disappointed to not see. Then also on the enablers side, it's around how do we interact with consumers better through building renovation passports, which we're currently developing, but also we're working on green rental agreements, which are similar to green leases that Bev touched upon. So it's all about looking at these barriers to investment and developing new solutions to actually overcome them. A couple of numbers. Another thing that we want to do is, at the minute, it's being phrased by Bayes that there's up to £65 billion of investment needed to reach EPCC by 2035. And another thing that we're trying to work on the Institute is to reframe that from being a challenge and being a cost to being an investment opportunity. It's frustrating when it's always reported as a cost, because going forward, it will make better financial sense for banks to invest in these early and to innovate and be the first movers in the space. So that's the other thing that we're kind of working on.
And just give us the sort of background context to Green Finance Institute. Is it part of government? What's its sort of status?
Yeah, sure. So we were born out of the back of the Green Finance Task Force, which was established by the government in, I think, 2017, to how the government can green the economy. The first recommendation in a series of recommendations was to establish a centre for public-private collaboration, and that's what became the Green Finance Institute. So we have seed funding from the government, but we don't answer to the government. But we do provide a helpful hand to them. So we work as the mouth of the green finance industry to feed into some of the policy work. But our private finance work that we're doing is seeing how can we innovate right now in the current rules of the game, but also try to make the rules of the game better, which will catalyse more investment going forward.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And Wayne, we've already had questions in about grants and costs and things. Tell us a little bit about the sources that you were able to tap into, and are there generally available grants for retrofitting that people can use?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex landscape, Paul, and I guess one of the things, and I think Ryan's touched on it there, we need to do is simplify that in some respects. So there is an obvious route to getting delivery done at scale. So we've previously benefited from Interreg Northwest Europe funds, European Regional Development funds to get initiatives off the ground. Obviously, we're currently swinging to social housing, decarbonisation, demonstrator funds, green homes grants, local authority delivery. So we're now channeling into some of the recent government announcements and some of the opportunities that are available there. One thing that gives me kind of hope, optimism, I think, for how we can deliver on tackle this big issue is some of what's happening with the local energy hubs. So obviously across England, there's now 5 local energy hubs funded by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. There's a host organisation for each of those, and obviously they cover a specific geographical area. And we in Nottingham, we host the Midlands Energy Hub, so covering 9 local enterprise partnership areas across the Midlands, so Welsh border to East Coast. And what Treasury and government are doing at the moment is utilising those hubs to get the money into the regions. And I think that for me is a real key. So the Green Homes Grants Local Authority Delivery 2 will be administering and facilitating that for the Midlands, with an allocation per local authority for what their housing stock. Again, it reflects their housing stock number, and how they can then look to deploy that across their own area. So that's particularly exciting. I think the other bolt onto that is we've recently been running and it's ongoing at the moment, and people can absolutely look this up. For SMEs and individuals, we've been running a training program, again funded via BAYS. That's a £7 million training program in retrofit skills, with the idea that people can access green jobs, retrain, and it's for both SMEs, so they can put the whole business through that kind of training, or individuals. And we've appointed numerous training providers across the region. And again, there's availability on those, subsidised availability on those courses and those skill training sessions. So I think it's the two ends again of joining this up, where we make sure there's the right skills in the marketplace to facilitate the large amount of delivery we've got on. I mentioned at the start, Paul, that we've probably got in the pipeline and funded at the moment around about 900 properties. And the thing that I'm pushing the project team for is how are we going to do that in the timeline, because the availability of those skills is limited. And that's a big challenge, I think, as this ramps up, that we make sure we're not just feeding the funding in at one end, we're looking to balance that with the requisite skills at the other end as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for spelling those out for us. And similarly, Bev, albeit in the private sector and having to keep an eye on viability, is this something that funders are asking for and working with you to enable?
Yeah, I would say the investor community are certainly now much more interested in these topics than they ever have been. And within Bruntwood, we act in a number of different roles. So we are an investor, we're a developer, we're a partner and a landlord. So I think for us, it's easy to sort of look across the piece. So we probably understand some of those challenges more than maybe others. But I would say more than ever now, that's starting to be a factor in the commercial decision-making process. But touching on the point that Wayne made around the skills gap, I think as we start to plan out our project pipeline and we look across the portfolio and develop roadmaps for each of our individual assets, you start to realise the scale of the challenge. And as we look at the different technologies that we might want to employ within those buildings, for instance, a move maybe towards heat pumps, we know that there aren't the installers. We know that we just haven't got the skills to meet the challenge currently. So even if funding wasn't an object, and we said, right, in the next 12 months we're going to look at doing 30 buildings, we couldn't do it probably because the environment we're operating in just isn't there yet. And I think that's a collective challenge that we all need to address. So I think whilst we've all got lofty ambitions, there's almost going back to basics to understand what not just what the performance gap is to net zero, but also the stuff around what the skills gap is, what the supply chain gap is. Because I think one of the other things that impacts here is, and again, Wayne and Hannah will probably have more of a view on this from a domestic perspective. But Hannah talked about the policy framework changing, and I agree. I think the policy framework is changing, but we've had so many shifts in policy framework in the past. It's then difficult often to get the supply chain to buy into what you're trying to do. So creating that, all of the right pieces of the jigsaw to fit together to make the roadmap that we need to create happen, I think is something that within the next 12 months, 18 months or so, we really need to focus on. And as long as that policy framework does start to emerge and it is as robust as it looks like it could be, I think then, we've got half a chance.
Why is it difficult to get the supply chain to buy into that?
Simply because I think, when previously we've launched schemes, the Green Homes Grant or the Green Deal, particularly in the domestic arena, we've, as Wayne's alluded to, or Ryan said in yesterday's announcement, there wasn't that reassurance about the continuation of the grant. So we've got a supply chain who need to upskill themselves. They need to develop, in-house capabilities, and all of a sudden then the rug's pulled from under them. And then when the next thing comes along, it's like, well, actually, I'm not going to get involved in that because it just didn't work out last time. So almost the sins of the past are creating a little bit of a bottleneck for us at the moment.
Yeah, and the flip side of the cost challenge is how you price this for customers. And what are customers asking for? Are they asking for different types of space and net zero? And do you think they'd be willing to pay an enhanced rent, as Lee from HBD has asked in the audience?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and one we probably don't know the answer to yet. I think I can say that we're looking at different business models. So I think it's really important that the market tries to develop different solutions. So for us, and this is more of a new build property, we're now looking at a solution that might be you pay a little bit more in rent, but some of the energy in the building is free as a result of the technology that we've got in there. So your operating costs should be lower. Now, whether or not customers are prepared to pay an increased premium it's very much a risk from our perspective, but I feel that it's one that we need to take simply because we've got to try and move the needle a little bit here. We can't just keep relying on the same operating models that we've always had. If we're going to make this change, we've got to make it together, and that needs to be, the whole community, including customers. So we hope the demand's there. As I say, we can see it top down from investors. We hope that it's going to be bottom up from customers. And we're seeing a little bit of that in London. I think there's been quite a bit of research from JLL. We've done a little bit of market testing, but the proof is going to be in the pudding. And we're hoping to launch a net zero building in the coming days, and we'll see how that model works.
Oh, fantastic! You could have launched it today.
We tried, Paul, but we just couldn't find it.
Well, I'm sure we'll cover it on Place Northwest when the day is right. Hannah, were you going to pick up on something that Bev was saying before?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Bev's right to focus on the customer, and that's something that, again, that the government are pushing through the new social housing white paper, a really big push from the government on what do your customers want, what's important to your customers. You need to be transparent. And I suppose the other point I was going to make as well was for housing associations and also for private developers, the cost of retrofit has to sit alongside the cost of building safety, because ultimately, the two things sit side by side. I think the minister yesterday was saying, yes, you've got to push retrofit, but you've also got to build in the cost for building safety. So it's not only issues with supply chain, issues with grant being in place, grant being taken away. It's also a competing priorities and about getting buildings safe.
And Wayne, there's a couple of questions there. One was for the name of the training program. I don't know if that's Nottingham specific or if there's other training programs you can point people to, but also about how you pick the types of properties, how you decide which you're going to get the deep retrofit. Maybe you could talk us through the sort of age and types of properties.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So it's through the Midlands Energy Hub, and I think if people are happy to share a link, if I can, I'll try and post something maybe on my Twitter as well, so people can see and access that. But that essentially is a route through, and the training providers, as I say, they've all been procured now, so they're all in place. Which we think we've just got that concluded before Christmas, and that training is going to run out over the next 18 months. So we've got a small team who are administering that, making sure they hit KPIs, number of people trained, etc. So it's quite exciting because we've seen quite a lot of people go through that process, and as I say, there's still availability there, and it's across the Midlands as well. So I know it's from colleges to businesses who are actually the training providers, if they could detail how they were going to do that to us. So I'll happily share more info on that. I mean, some really good points made, and we're getting into the detail of it now. And as Bev and Hannah have touched on, customer is key to this, and we've been putting in place something similar, but a comfort plan. So where we can start to model what the costs will look like for those tenants and residents, but in a way that brings them out of fuel poverty. So it brings their costs down, but simultaneously make sure that we're able to improve the business model on a holistic level. So all people are benefiting, and actually those mini energy centres I mentioned, if they operate efficiently, will ensure the energy is only used where it's demanded at any given time, and flows of energy can go into properties rather than any being wasted. And again, if we can benefit from RHI or any subsidy incentives as well, that all links together into that overarching business model. As far as the properties and selecting the properties, again, it's been a point I think made a couple of times in regards to having that stock information at the outset. So critical. And what we've tried to do, if I'm honest, is target those that are in the worst conditions. So where we know we've got a particular fuel poverty problem and where we could have health implications. So I think wrapped up into this, Paul, is that bigger, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's layer upon layer, but that bigger proposition around the fact if we intervene in someone's property, that can actually benefit the public purse down the line, because it stops people presenting at their GP with issues, with respiratory issues due to living in a cold property. And again, that whole model and me working with the Health and Wellbeing Board in the city is crucial, I think, for the long-term planning of this. And we're obviously working with GPs as well, where we'll look at referrals from GPs, again, allowing us to target specific properties where they may see someone present in the surgery, again, with that kind of respiratory issue, and we can then target, they get a referral rather than a referral through to another health provider, they get a referral through to us as energy providers, and we see what we can do to help them potentially with support in any given property. So I think that kind of methodology in being smart in linking together agendas is really important to enabling us to fast track it. And then the rest, Paul, is very much on a where we can deliver basis. I think we've had the missing tooth analogy before, where we've delivered in our Nottingham City Homes properties and had a private property that didn't want to take part, private rented property, and it looked like a missing tooth in a row of newly renovated dwellings. So what we want to do is make sure there is a private offer as well. So when we're in a street, we're targeting everybody, all the homes and properties there, as opposed to missing anything out. And I'm pleased to say some of our latest tranches of funding have taken consideration of that as well. So we're now going into an area, tackling it in the right way from a efficiency perspective, both energy efficiency but time efficiency as well, and then moving on when we've concluded. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot, and there's obviously lots behind the scenes in regards to that modelling that's been taking place, and the new build angle is also important, because obviously we're in a situation where we've got to balance budgets, and we've got pressures around new build, and we've got pressures around retrofit, and navigating that in geographical areas is also a key for this.
Bev, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, just to pick up on the point around the links with health. Manchester have got a project on the go at the moment called the Greater Manchester Local Energy Market, which sounds very similar to the idea that Wayne's describing. This thing of, rather than our energy system being this great centralised beast, can we start looking at smaller decentralised energy systems? Is there value that we can drive from doing that and optimising our systems at a more local level? And I think once you start to overlay the impacts on health, kids who are from cold homes have poorer educational outcomes, and it's again that this, we're talking about decarbonising the Northwest, and it's about looking at all of those impacts, and I think it's really important that we try to take more of a holistic view, because otherwise we end up in this siloed thing of trying to create that value in an individual area, where often when we broaden our horizons, there are these broader impacts that from a societal perspective are hugely important.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they link up. And Ryan.
Yeah, I would just say that on that as well, these wider implications such as health need to then be considered in the impact on cost as well, because when the public purse is looking at this, I think the data on for every £1 spent on retrofitting fuel poor homes saves 42 pence in NHS costs. If you're the government looking at this, that needs to be factored in. Because again, the way this is usually framed is just it's going to cost a lot. You need to look at the savings. As Bev touched upon there as well, the people that you're going to have better education will lead to future productivity, future economic growth, future tax receipts. And it's all interlinked and all needs to be considered when you're looking at the cost.
And whilst we've been talking about customers, Ryan, talk to us a little bit about green leases, how they work, what some of the other more consumer-facing products that you have on your portfolio.
Yep, so green leases or green rental agreements, this is really targeted at getting over that landlord-tenant split incentive that Bev's touched upon. It's a huge issue because obviously if I'm the landlord and I take out the loan, I'm not gaining any of the energy benefits in reduced bills. What the green lease would look to do is it's what's called a warm rent, where you factor in the actual rent, but also all the energy costs. And a percentage of the energy savings would accrue to the person living in the property. So they have an incentive to, not leave their heating on all day and leave the windows open. And then a larger percentage of it will go to the landlord, which then is important because that will help them repay the loan they had to take out to perform the retrofit in the first place. In terms of what we're doing on this, we've been working with a large landlord in London, a couple of legal firms, in drawing up these contracts. We're hoping to be publishing some sort of framework around this later this year. But I think that's a really exciting place to be looking. And unfortunately, Bev, it's currently only the residential space we're looking, but potentially in the future commercial, potentially in the future social housing as well. I think that's very exciting to be looking at. Another one that's more consumer facing that we've been developing is a building renovation passport. So what this is it's kind of a data handbook of a property, and it details everything the property currently has, so EPC, but also other angles. But then on the flip side, it provides the consumer a clear path for what their property can achieve in terms of measures, but also in terms of the financing options available to them. One of the biggest blockers that we've seen is simply lack of consumer understanding, lack of consumer awareness. You can produce all these various options for them, but if they don't know how to take them up, it's not going to happen. We saw with the Green Homes Grant, the marketing on it was big, and you got uptake being rather large. Then obviously we have the issue around installs, but that's a different topic. It's all around getting the information to the consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Wayne, we've had the budget yesterday. You've mentioned some of the grants and the funding that you've used, some UK, some Europe, European historically, obviously. How would you sum up the amount that the government is making for the industry for these sorts of changes?
Yeah, it was interesting yesterday, Paul, because we obviously watched with interest and worked closely with BEIS as that Midlands hub. So we were aware certainly of the next tranches, as I say, of Green Homes grants through the local authority delivery. Obviously, there's been some issues with the direct vouchers for Green Homes grants. But I think the most interesting thing from my perspective is aligning that with some of what's been discussed in the National Infrastructure Bank announcement and the potential for collaboration. So I think people have alluded to it. The only way we can really tackle this issue is in a collaborative way and working together, certainly across larger regions. So I think with the Midlands, we'd be looking at the potential for authorities to collaborate in submissions and come forward with large scale changes that can be made. And I think that would incentivise things like the National Infrastructure Bank to support. So I'm starting to think about things like heat networks on a large scale, retrofitting in particular locations that would enable both retrofit but also new properties to come on board with a new heating provision. So things like that, I think, is a change in mindset of how we've got to look to tackle this. And I think we've probably all mentioned it in some respects, and it feels like government announcements and the budget are pointing us in that direction, where large scale, as Ryan says, probably makes the most sense financially, allows for those greater commitments, allows for those bigger returns, but also gives us a joined up approach so we're not getting ad hoc pockets of innovation and delivery. So I think for me that was the fundamental piece that came out yesterday.
Yeah, okay. And Bev, you mentioned at the outset about sometimes looking at a piecemeal approach rather than a sort of big grand plan that just isn't feasible when you've got occupiers, you've got customers that are in offices. Are there any specific examples that maybe people that are watching can take away and see if they can implement those or discuss them in their project teams in terms of those piecemeal actions?
Yeah, I think, you know, there isn't a one size fits all when you're looking at these solutions. Hannah mentioned it right at the start. You know, one of the biggest things you can do is get going. So that would certainly be my advice as a starting point. I think the second thing is you've really got to get to grips with your data. So as soon as you've got good data, you can start to understand how your building's performing and where it's maybe not performing so well. That then leads on to being able to make informed decisions about, is it then a fabric issue? Is it an HVAC issue? You know, you can, that sort of stepped approach can be really insightful in terms of making sure you don't just think, oh, right, well, I need to install heat pumps. That might not be the right solution at the right time. It is the almost like Ryan's idea of a building passport. You really need to do that mapping out thing. There's loads of resource out there now. There's some, you know, there's fantastic free resource available. We've got brilliant consultancy support. We are all on the journey together. But I think it's let's share where we all are, and events like these, and certainly where we're doing case studies where we can show other people what worked well, what didn't work well, and similarly doing that internally to make sure, you know, organisations are all on the same path. That for me is probably the big takeaway. There isn't a thing where I could say, you know, we normally would always say fabric first from an energy management perspective. It's not that simple sometimes in a large multi-occupancy building. You know, you might need to do something internal to the fabric. So it's learn what you can, get the advice that you can, develop your roadmap. But for me, getting started and understanding your data would be the two big takeaways.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you. And Hannah, whilst we've been talking about costing and the funding implications, you clearly, registered providers, housing associations have the appetite. Do they have the funding, from your experience of what you've seen, to really make a change, or is there a gap there for government or other sources to fill to enable this level of retrofit?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer across the piece, because different organisations will have access to, you know, different funds. Certainly, I think you know, the availability of grant, and, you know, whether it's government grant or grant from local authorities, and be able to focus that towards retrofitting, I think it is really key. I mean, housing associations, I sit on the board of a housing association, and we've got our away day tomorrow where we're focusing on our decarbonisation agenda. We're a 10,000 unit stock transfer, so we've got really, really leaky homes. But what I find is that housing associations are very dynamic and very good at going out and finding these opportunities. So I think if you asked every housing association, you'd probably get a different answer to it, depending on, you know, where they're based, how active their local authority is, you know, what their local plan says around, you know. So in London, just had the London plan adopted. Whilst that's probably more relevant to new build, you know, the Mayor of London's got a real push for carbon neutrality. So I think if you, like I say, I think if you asked any housing association, you'd probably get a different answer. But what I think they will say is that they're really interested in some of the projects that Ryan's been talking about, because that then builds in certainty, and then you can plan with certainty.
Yeah. And Wayne, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about the results. How are you? Obviously, it's early days, but are you monitoring yet? Are you seeing results come through? Can you tell us any stories about the response from customers, residents?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I think some of the residents in the first properties, the first 10 we did, became celebrities in the city in their own right. They were either on the radio or Notts TV every other day, which was great, and thankfully they were saying it was good. So I think that was the first tick in the box for us, that they were happy with the results. And I'm glad to say monitoring that's gone on afterwards has shown that as well. So it's achieving those standards, and I think that's again due to the real rigorous analysis of what we were doing that we presented at the outset. So that's been a positive. I suppose the challenges are some of those who are in the market delivering the solutions, and we procured a smaller businesses. So some of the long-term warranties, we have to just be conscious that some of those that might have issues, if we get to year 15 and we've got a problem, is that warranty still going to be somewhere we can go back? So we've had to build in a little bit of contingency in and around that. But yeah, as it stands, those properties, the energy efficiency of them is performing as we'd expect, and more data is becoming available, as you'll appreciate, as we roll on in time, but also in volume of properties that we've applied this solution to, and we'll be sharing that information through our kind of carbon neutral annual report, which the next one is due in June, where information on our retrofitting program can be found. I think interestingly, the bolt-on is the additional benefits we found that we probably didn't look at the start, and that'll come out through an evaluation process. So we've improved neighbourhoods, we've improved how people perceive locations, and actually that's had a additional benefit of pride of place. We're seeing, people maybe looking at their gardens in a different way and using those spaces outside the properties in a different way. And again, it all links back to that well-being angle, and probably a takeaway from me in that is that we need to factor some of those other benefits in at the outset, even if it's in a business case of a different sort. So we're not purely looking at it from a financial perspective. So that's absolutely one additional item that I'd flag as a big positive.
Yeah, and has there been any resistance encountered?
As ever, there's always some scenarios where people are concerned or maybe have their reservations, and I think that's really for us then to get our kind of local neighbourhood officers, so our development officers in the area, to go and talk people through exactly why we're doing what we're doing and what it's going to achieve. And I think that's across the wider carbon neutral agenda. We've certainly seen in the city the knowledge of our citizens and residents on this whole agenda, and the appetite for getting involved and being supportive increase. And we're getting some fantastic suggestions, proposals, consultation responses. It seems to be becoming a higher and higher priority in the city. And I think that journey is enabling us then to speak to residents about retrofitting the right way, because we're finding people understand it. They get what we're trying to do, and quite often they're receptive to that.
Yeah, and one of the other questions that we had was about measuring embodied carbon. So the materials you're using, the parts, the equipment, the technology that goes in, is that measured as well?
Yeah, and obviously those scope of emissions are important for our carbon neutral analysis. So through our procurement colleagues, we are factoring in carbon outlay, and that's something, again, decision making in the organisation. It's really important that we have carbon and environmental considerations at that top table of decision making. So people familiar with local authorities know the cornerstones are probably finance, procurement, legal. We've now got carbon considerations up at that same level. So before we take any decision, before we procure anything, we're making sure that those who come forward in a tender response or any decision that does go forward to be enacted has got a carbon implication factored in. And if we're serious about net zero, that's the way we've got to do it. And it's a balancing act, Paul. We want to see economic regeneration, and we want to achieve carbon neutrality. And there's a tightrope to walk in the middle of that, in how we do that and how the two work with each other to make that happen. And obviously the buzz phrase, I guess, is green recovery, and that's something we're very much promoting in the city.
Yeah, and Bev, similarly, whilst we're on results and measurements, monitoring, we've seen some negative headlines in the last year or so around energy performance certificates, how they weren't producing reliable results, that people were questioning, some horror story numbers of how far out they were. it's hard to know what's accurate. And given the infamously complex nature of the building world and different suppliers at different stages, and people install it, then they hand it over to somebody else, and they're the manager, and so on. What's the level of risk for actually not being able to get an accurate picture at the end of the retrofit to see how it's performing?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. The issues you touched on there, Paul, around things like BREEAM, when we design a building and we say this is how it's going to perform, and then we get the building up and running, and it's often, I think the latest study said it was 3.8 times the predicted energy use. And the other thing is, a lot of these certifications don't measure all of the energy. There are different types of energy, weirdly, regulated and unregulated within buildings. So I think this idea of us getting to something that's transparent is really important. And the Energy White Paper talked about whether or not we can move towards some sort of operational energy metric. And I think that's going to be huge in driving the agenda. We need to see what the buildings are doing on a day-to-day basis. And part of that is again, that contract between landlord and customer. Even if the customer's got their own energy supply, we need to be able to say that this is what's happening in this building if we're really going to tackle this subject. One of the other things that's an interesting development, I think, is the introduction of neighbours, which is this rating scheme for office space. Been hugely successful in Australia, now over here. And I think the simplicity of that scheme might be something that really works for landlords and occupiers. It's based on operational energy. It's a star system, so it's something that we can all relate to fairly easily without getting into the depths of a BREEAM or some other CIBSE type certifications. So I think it's about trying to bring ease of understanding, a sort of a commonality that we're all happy with, and trying to get some transparency around data, because that's, I think, that idea of we retrofit something or we build something, and once it's in, it's like, okay, good luck with that. And very often we don't look at optimizing systems and so on. And there's also the piece around are people really cognizant of the energy they're using, and some of that then links back into some, do we really need to be creating more of a structure around customer forums to make sure that we're talking about these issues, the green lease issue. So I think there's a whole host of levels that we could start to do this on, but talking about energy, what we're doing today, not what we modelled it as, something that's transparent and relates to operational efficiency, is key for me.
Yeah. And similarly, Ryan, is when obviously you've got public funding, you've got lenders that are keen to do the right thing and see that their money is used in the way that they promised. Is accountability after products have been served into the market and issued, is that an important part of what you do as well?
Yeah, it's almost central to it, because what we just said there about measuring the actual cost savings and the actual energy usage is important from a financier's point of view when you're pricing in the risk for a certain product. If you are associating energy cost savings with repaying some of that debt, if you can't accurately measure it, that is riskier. When it's riskier, you price it higher, and therefore it's more costly. And that's a huge issue. So being able to have these live trackings is actually very useful. Wayne touched earlier upon Energy Strong style comfort plans, and they're actually a really good idea when it comes to this sort of thing. Wayne can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding of comfort plans is that the consumer will pay a certain amount to the person who's provided the retrofit, and then they are guaranteed a sort of energy cost saving if they adhere to certain requirements daily. From a bank's point of view, that means that if I'm the one lending the debt, I can look at a comfort plan and know that monthly or yearly, I'm receiving this amount of cash flow back to me. So long answer to your question was that. The short answer is absolutely accurately measuring it is important when it comes to financing decisions. Yeah.
And if you're able to share, there's some questions about links for the building renovation passports. We'll be sending out links because there's a lot of technical information, and a lot of people clearly keen to get on with their journey towards low carbon net zero as we go through this. I mean, we touched on regulations a little bit. What do the panel think is the most sort of effective way in terms of whether it's the carrot or the stick? Is it funding and incentives to get both developers and consumers using less energy, or is it a regulatory planning led system that is going to be the most effective?
I think, Paul, from my perspective, and I would say this one, it's a bit of both, and I think the message at the moment we're looking at is, particularly with MEES legislation, there's obviously probably not been enforcement there. It's fair to say at the right kind of level. So I think perhaps looking at how that's enforced is something that government are going to be pursuing in the coming, probably over the next 12 months, and probably using those local energy hubs to be part of that, so they can give them an insight into certainly when we're working with private landlords, but how we can support. And at the other end, it is that carrot element where there is routes into energy efficiency programs for all. I think we've probably made the point a few times. It feels like a common place where we actually need to make sure the landscape's navigable. So if there are people looking for support, or there are people looking to engage just from an information perspective, it's easy for them to do so, and that's something we're working on in the city. So I think you need it at both ends of that spectrum to enable people to feel like it's not just either a stick or carrot at the other end.
Yeah, I would echo that. It feels like a bit of a cop-out to say a bit of both, but it is the correct answer. A real longer-term stick with immediate carrots, and then as people don't adhere to them, even more sticks. So in terms of, you make voluntary targets, and in the near term you offer financial incentives, but as people don't do it, then you start putting down penalties, and eventually you're going to have a holistic move of markets. Quickly, Paul, just down back to your question on building renovation passports. I've got in trouble before for announcing dates of announceables, but unfortunately we couldn't announce it this week, but I think next week we'll be launching our framework on building renovation passports. So I will send a link over to that when it's out.
Okay, I'm sure that met the protocol. Beautifully done. And Bev?
And hit the nail on the head for me. It does sound like a cop-out, but it's got to be a little bit of both. If you go too heavy on the stick, you end up with everybody just doing ticking a box. If you go too heavy on the carrot, you may be promoting the wrong behaviour. So I think the approach that Ryan highlighted with a longer term stick, but trying to lead everybody along with the carrot is probably the right one for me. I think also as a developer, we want to see much more of a sort of a level playing field here. So I think we're really keen that we start to see something around carrot and stick. It's not been utilised in the best way, I don't think, previously, but hopefully, as I said before, the policy framework is starting to move in the right direction for that.
Yeah.
I think, Paul, just to throw in as well, from a local authority perspective, certainly supplementary planning guidance is something we're looking at across that carbon neutral board, and I think that kind of information, the standards we're looking at getting out there for both developers and of kind of new build, but also so people can see from a retrofit perspective what we're hoping to achieve. I think that's an important message and something we're hoping to launch again as part of our carbon neutral work, and just to reiterate that will align to commercial and domestic as well. So quite important.
Yeah, superb. Hannah, thank you for your persistence. The gremlins have obviously entered your house today. That was just a question about carrot and stick approach. Is it the sort of regulatory penal system, or is it going to be incentives and funding that achieves the best results? And any thoughts to add around that?
I think going back to where I started really, which is we know what the outcome is. you know, the Climate Act tells us we've all got to be carbon neutral by 2050. So I think it's, you know, that's the biggest stick that there is, really, I think. So it's definitely the carrots along the way. And it's really interesting to hear some of the contributions from the panel. I'm particularly interested, Wayne, about around planning, because it does seem to me that planning is missing out a little bit here, because planning is always, and building regulations are pushing down a particular path in terms of new build. But you know, I think if Nottingham taking taking a stance on using planning policies around retrofit as well to start to embed that policy, I think that's fantastic, and that sits alongside, you know, the other things we've talked about, like, you know, grants and customers, you know, their wish that they want to live in the houses that they can afford to live in. So yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just on the planning one, Paul, Hannah, again, it's a really strong point. And I think what we've tried to do is work with the core cities. So we have a core cities group as well, that enables us to make sure that we're putting forward consistent planning requirements, or trying to. And I think that's fundamental, because for that economic regeneration, if we're consistent, a developer can't come to Nottingham and we say, hold on, that doesn't meet our standards, and then they head off to Bristol instead. Actually, wherever they go, there's a consistency, and that message is getting out. And certainly on the planning guidance, we've taken a more localised but a similar approach, where across our Nottinghamshire districts and boroughs, we've tried to put together a document that we're all going to sign off on. And I think that, again, puts a message out that this is a consistent approach, and it's not just one area taking a stand. And I think for the level of change we need, that's going to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you've described there is exactly what developers say they do, don't they? They go to where it's easiest to do the development. Fantastic. Really enjoyed that. Thank you all for a brilliant contribution, and giving up your time and sharing your insights this morning. Hopefully that's been useful and enjoyable at home. Thank you all for joining us. Please do stick around for some networking if you have time. It'd be good to see some friendly faces in the other room. Thanks again to our wonderful sponsors, Morgan Sindall Construction, Devonshire's, Hydrock. And the next Place Northwest event is on 16th of March. It's the mayoral debate for the Metro Mayors in Liverpool City Region and Greater Manchester, as Steve Rotherham and Andy Burnham go up for re-election. Then at the end of March, on 31st of March, we have another hot topic with our annual logistics sector briefing. Details of all of our events, of course, are on the website. Thanks for joining us today, and see you again soon. Thanks all.